Welcome to Our Dyke Histories. I'm your host, Jack Gieseking, historian, geographer, and environmental psychologist. We dive into the past and present of les, queer, trans, sapphic, MB communities decade by decade in collaboration with multicultural lesbian literary and art journal Sinister Wisdom. This season, we're all about dyke bars, with an asterisk. Lesbian bars, queer parties, and trans hangouts. The structures that made them necessary, the lives they made possible, and the worlds we made from them. Our Dyke Histories. Come for the history, stay for the revolution, gossip, and desire that built us. Hello there, Our Dyke History listeners. I hope you are keeping safe and in the northern hemisphere warm in these continuing polar vortexes and lack of ice melting yet. Today we are in Detroit, a city filled with a rich black history, with pollution, with policing, with resistance and revolution, and throughout its history, an extraordinary site for black queer women. It is also home to the first black lesbian bar, I think, in the U.S., founded in 1939. In this episode, we get to talk to the amazing Roey Thorpe. Roey is an activist, and she did a master's thesis back in the 1990s, interviewing nearly 50 black and white queer women who told stories about the 1930s through the 1970s. She published 2 papers about them, and you'll get to hear about how important they've become to queer history. We touch on how much the structures of higher education shape the possibilities and limits of queer history. A definite highlight of this episode is the revealing of what Roey calls the Barbara Smith test. I adore it. Let's jump in.
My name's Roey Thorpe. I am a person living in Portland, Oregon. I'm a white femme lesbian, former academic, and have been an activist for LGBTQ rights and other social justice issues for decades. And I'm really happy to be here.
I am so excited to talk to you. You said former academic, and that's actually why you're here, because you wrote 2 of, I think, some of the most important chapters of les queer history, even trans history. Can you tell us about these chapters?
Sure. I was writing a doctoral dissertation in the early to mid 90s. So when it came time to write my dissertation, queer history was a brand new field at the time and wasn't really recognized by my women's history program. It was like 1993, 94. It was just starting, but my professors didn't know anything about queer history. And so I decided just to go out on a limb. I mean, LGBTQ history had never been mentioned in any of my classes, my women's history classes. And I remember my grad school advisor in the mid 90s said to me, "Oh, I just discovered this writer. Her name is Audre Lorde. And have you heard of her? You should know about her." And I said, "Well,
Oh
currently
my
she's the
God.
poet laureate of New York." And
Just that.
right. And she has been like she inspired generations of people. I just couldn't believe that he had never heard of her. Anyway, all that is to say that it was very odd for me to decide that I would embark on an oral history project that would be about lesbians in Detroit. But I was very interested in the kind of what we would today call the intersection of race, class, sexuality, and gender in the community, in lesbian communities and for lesbian experience. And so I thought, what better place than Detroit? Because Detroit was such a post-World War II boom city. So much was happening in terms of race. So much was happening in terms of women. So many opportunities, so much unrest. And so I thought this would be the perfect place. And it made a lot of sense to me. And I was really familiar with the city, but it made sense, it turned out, to almost no one else.
And so, for everybody listening, if you have never read Roey's chapters, probably in a class, they are widely taught in many LGBTQ history classes. Did you know that, Roey?
I did not know that.
Okay,
No.
so yes, the chapters that Roey wrote were called A House Where Queers Go, African American, Lesbian Nightlife in Detroit, 1940 to 75, and The Changing Face of Lesbian Bars in Detroit, 38 to 65. And when I say they're widely taught and they're widely cited, because as I just told Roey before we started, there was not a lot written on Black queer women's experience with a really critical, intelligent, anti-racist lens until the 2010s. There wasn't like a real depth of work, and especially about spaces. I found your materials at the Cornell Sexuality Archives,
Yes.
Zwickler, and I thought, oh my God, would she talk to us? Oh my God. So this is a absolutely over the moon moment for me. And we all love Roey Thorpe, but Roey, you did not know how loved you were. I'm so sorry. I'm so glad you get to find out now.
I'm kind of flabbergasted, I have to tell you. I mean,
Ah!
this work was something that was really dear to me, really important to me personally, and changed my life in so many ways, and the people that I met through it, and the things that I learned. But there were so many circumstances that made it impossible for me to finish my doctorate. So I never did, and I never became an academic, even though I had wanted to. I had to leave all that behind. And, it was not without a lot of grief. It's so gratifying and like amazing to me to hear. I just assumed that there were a million things that had come after that work that were so much better, that were written by Black women, that were, taking things way further than I could have.
Whoa. So Roey is doing her research in the early 90s. And this is a very important moment because in 1992, a string of books are going to come out. And they're going to make it seem to everyone who came after him that there always was lesbian history to turn to. These are The Incredible Boots of Leather, Slippers of Gold about Buffalo, Stone Butch Blues by the forever extraordinary Leslie Feinberg, and our own Lillian Faderman's Odd Girls and Twilight Lovers, which is a 100-year national lesbian history. This is a moment when Audre Lorde, Queen of Queens, is not even part of the canon yet. We continue to produce an incredible amount of queer history, from Instagram accounts and podcasts like this one to websites like outhistory.org or preservation work like the NYC LGBT Sites Project, and on and on. But because most people who want to study lesbi, queer, trans history are told there's not many jobs in that, I disrecommend you doing it. Most people only wind up doing a master's thesis on it, if anything at all. If you want to read something about a place like Toledo, where Roey is from, or Baltimore, where I'm from, it definitely exists. It just mostly doesn't get published. So I would still guess that the majority of queer history, particularly about small towns, rural places, is locked away behind a paywall. It's called the ProQuest Thesis and Dissertation Database. If you have access to a university login, you can enjoy all of this work, and please do, especially and at the same time as we're watching the intense attacks against higher education, against faculty, curriculum, academic freedom, open critical thinking. We should know that the university has always been a hotbed, a word I use intentionally, for LGBTQ understanding, development, community, and history making. So as much as LGBTQ people have been exhausted by the academic system, by professors, by senior people, administrators, funders who do not care or do not get how important our history is, we have made a home there and built worlds there. Do defend your local and every university. So I'm really excited to talk about Detroit and why it was exciting. Who did you talk to? Tell us about the people.
I interviewed 48 people who had lived as lesbians in Detroit in the 20s all the way through the 70s. So I didn't know how to find them, and I just started using word of mouth. I was lucky enough to find Reverend Renee McCoy, who now lives in Seattle, but at the time was the pastor at the Full Truth Fellowship of Christ Church, which was a Black LGBTQ church in Detroit. And Renee said that if I started going to the church, I'm half Jewish and half Arab Syrian, went to, if I would go to the church, that, I could meet some people. And so I started attending and met some people through that, and met Ruth Ellis through some kind of group of women who connected me with her. I met a lot of white lesbians who were also really challenging to track down because most people were pretty closeted. And none of the black lesbians knew the white lesbians. None of the white lesbians knew the black lesbians. They would say to me, black women would say, how are you going to meet any white lesbians? Do you like, how are you going to find them? I don't even know if there are any. And I would say,
Hmm.
well, look at me, I'm one. And they would say, oh, yeah, I guess so, but how are you going to find them? And it was just like a really fascinating experience because the segregation was so complete
Yeah,
between the communities. But I just used word of mouth and ended up talking to a lot of people. No one felt like they had a story that was worth sharing. And
of
then I would
course.
sit down with them and my little cassette tape recorder. And 4 hours later, they would still have stories to tell. It was amazing.
Okay, total nerd side note. I don't know what it is, but it's amazing that in my research, I happened to find, with much effort, 47 people to interview for a Queer New York. And in Boots of Leather and Slippers of Gold, the 1930s to 1960s lesbi queer trans histories of Buffalo, that also had 47 people, which I found out after the fact. And Roey interviewed 48. Maybe that's like a dyke minion. Anyway, everyone I've ever heard interview lesbi queer trans people is that their interviewees tell them, I don't know if my story counts. Oh my God, if you're listening, your story counts. It doesn't matter what your gender sexuality is. Your story counts. It doesn't matter what your race or class or abilities are. Your story counts. It's so important. And if you are queer, this is yet another sweet, kind, winky nudge to send your stuff to the Lesbian Herstory Archives or a local queer archive because you and your voice and your stories matter. The other thing that's standing out to me too is Boots of Leather, Slippers of Gold tells a story that's very much Black people and white people getting along, and it doesn't have any stories about racism or segregation. But like as time has gone on, you start to hear different perspectives about Buffalo, and there definitely was segregation, and there was segregation in every space, in every bar, in every party for all time. Whether it's people saying I shouldn't be in that bar, I should not be going to a Black queer space because that is a Black queer space, and I want to honor it. But there's also people who are racist, and a lot of them, right? So, and even that's changed over times, these spaces still remain segregated. And while especially bars that are open now, queer bars and lesbian bars and parties have worked to be more inclusive, a lot of people have said, actually, this is a space just for us. Like Poppy Juice in New York City is very clear that this is really a space for BIPOC, queer and trans people, white people, if you'd like to come. Actually, the way you can contribute is buy somebody a ticket who can't afford it. And there's lots of parties like that.
One of the things that I was constantly challenged on when I would talk about the research I was doing was whether or not I should write about Black lesbians because I'm white. I understand the concerns with that, but it was always a direct challenge, and it was almost always from white people. It's one of the things that breaks my heart now to know that there wasn't like a whole ton of stuff that came out immediately right around when I did my writing about Black lesbians. Because, first of all, I wasn't only writing about Black lesbians and I wasn't claiming any kind of special knowledge, but I feel like there was a damper put on that
Yeah.
research. I also think that what is part of that vibe from people about like don't do it is that there's a lack of understanding or of openness to hearing
Mm,
about racism that can come from white people. I will say when I go back and read the interviews that I did, I can see things that I missed. And I also remember how hard it was for me to see it. Like I had to read over and over and over again and keep asking myself hard questions in order to understand. And I'm pretty sure that, if I had been more aware, either because I myself was a person of color and had experienced racism, or because I was more evolved as a human, I think I would have seen it sooner. But it took a lot for me to begin to see it. And then once I began to see it and I started to see how it worked, then I could see it everywhere. So I think that any account that doesn't see it and explore it is missing a whole other narrative and set of narratives.
Yeah, and it's a defining narrative, and it's being ignored and
Absolutely.
whitewashed, literally. How we get our queer history, our les queer trans history, is often through academic research. There are definitely oral histories projects that people do, but then without funding, resources, and structure to publish, it's really exhausting. And the academy, as you're saying, mostly white people are saying this, was mostly white, and it remained mostly white. I mean, even till today.
Yeah.
And the number of Black queer women who would be out in the academy in the 90s or even the aughts, they were so few in number. Like, what supports would they have? How people would treat them, and it was disgusting. It was disdainful. So that those factors kind of screwed us over. It just quieted so many voices and so much legitimate research that got denied and ignored. But thank goodness yours didn't.
You asked me how I found the people, and I
Yeah.
am like, so there's a story about Barbara Smith. So one of the few openly Black queer women's voices was Barbara Smith in academia.
Barbara Smith in and beyond academia. Fuck, she shaped the entire academic canon. In the 80s, she co-wrote or co-edited with people ranging from Cherry Morega to Minnie Bruce Pratt to her sister Beverly Smith. She published books like All the Women Are White, All the Blacks Are Men, But Some of Us Are Brave, Black Women's Studies. Yours in Struggle, 3 feminist perspectives on anti-Semitism and racism. And then she was in and central to the publication of a book you've definitely heard about called This Bridge Called My Back, Writings by Radical Women of Color, a book that comes out in 1981 and actually is the first book to use the word women of color. She's a brilliant person. She co-founded the Kitchen Table Press. She's like hanging out with Gloria Anzaldúa and Audre Lorde. Like, if there is a Frank Sinatra Rat Pack equivalent to lesbian history, Barbara Smith is like Frank Sinatra or Dean Martin, like, clearly, and so much cooler. On top of that, Smiths had this idea called identity politics, a word we still use, and her work was the groundwork for the term every college and university has gifted us, Kimberly Crenshaw's idea of intersectionality, right? You're not just Black or a woman, you are all of these identities at once, and how do they intersect? But wait, Barbara Smith isn't done. After co-founding the Combahee River Collective, woot woot, in part at Mount Holyoke College, just a shout out to our alma mater, she also put together Black Lesbians, which is a bibliographic project. And this is something that Kate McKinney got me excited about in their book, Information Activism, that I want to share with you because it's actually mind-blowing to think about. But in the 70s and 80s, lesbians, queers, trans people, still even till recently, gay men, didn't have access to our history or even materials that talked about us positively. If you were going to go to the library, most of the stuff you were going to find was telling you you were a horrible, deviant person, etc., etc., etc. Cis white heteronormativity sucks. So what happened in the late 70s, early 80s is a few dykes started to think about making indices. They started making lists of materials that were actually awesome. And these are just mimeographed Xerox sheets. Mimeograph is the thing before Xerox. And people would just turn them out and then hand them from friend to friend to friend. And the one Barbara Smith put together is called Black Lesbians. She wrote, per Kate McKinney, that the bibliography generated the excitement of finally having a substantial body of information on Black lesbians. She later wrote that it can inspire us Black lesbians to write about and to manifest our lives in every way possible. I love this because Barbara Smith has been the foremother of so much incredible work on Black lesbians and Black women, but she's also touched all of our lives and shaped the entire academic canon just as much as Audre Lorde. Like, she has been a force of nature.
She's incredible. I mean, you do not mess with Barbara Smith. And that is very clear. And it's something I completely aspire to. So, what happened was when I was contacting Reverend Renee McCoy, the first thing she said to me was, well, I might be interested in talking with you, but first, you're going to need to talk to Barbara Smith. And I said, Barbara Smith, like I was sort of like, oh my gosh, I can't talk to Barbara Smith. I am not worthy. So she says, well, you're going to have to talk to her and get her approval. And I said, okay. So I contact Barbara Smith, and this is in the days really like before email was even. I think I called Barbara Smith a couple of times and left messages. And she finally called me back, and I explained to her that, Reverend McCoy had said that I needed to talk to her. And she just burst out laughing. And she said, really? And I said, yeah, I think that you're like a hurdle I have to get over.
I
And
love that.
and she said, indeed. And so then she asked me a couple of questions, and she said, okay, you can tell her you've passed the test. So I said, thank you. And, and then I gushed like something about how much her work had meant to me. And she was like, okay, goodbye, dear. And then I told Reverend McCoy that Barbara Smith had given me the thumbs up. And from there, the project could proceed. And
From
there it
that.
was. That's how it got started. I look back on that so fondly because I think of it as Black women taking care of each other, and about having to show intent and to go through hurdles that are imposed by Black women themselves in order to be able to proceed. And it was
Yeah.
very beautiful and meaningful
Yeah.
in retrospect.
And a way to keep yourself safe as much as possible from
Yes,
racist assholes. Yeah.
absolutely.
So that's incredible to hear that. So before you even get started, you pass the Barbara Smith test. One must dream. And then you start writing. I know that the Sweetheart Bar is the first Black lesbian bar in Detroit. So it might be the first actually in the US. And that's in 1939. So can you tell us about it, what it was like?
It was put together on a thread in many ways and very much in the tradition of the Harlem Renaissance.
I need to jump in here and tell you something awesome. In case you didn't listen to the 1920s and 1930s episodes, there are no Black queer women's bars in Harlem. There are definitely cabarets that someone like Mabel Hampton is working at, hanging out in, and there's tons of queer women working there. There's a prominent club called the Clam House, so well titled, with performers like the fabulous Gladys Bentley dazzling the audience. But that was a slumming bar. There might be a number of performers who are Black queer women. Most of the staff could be Black queer women, but most of the audience was white, seemingly cis hetero couples who were coming up to, as it was called then, participate in slumming and gawk at the exoticized, racialized, queered others. So now if we come back to Detroit in 1939, these wonderful people who created the Sweetheart Bar thought that they were catching up, but actually, and this fills my heart with so much joy, they were so ahead of the curve. In fact, so much of queer history is built with the idea that, wow, somebody else did this in someplace else. Wow, somebody built this bar, this bookstore. They attained this kind of level of community. And those ideas of what is possible, a geographical, sociological imagination of a world we can have, feeds us so much. And I just think this is beautiful and awesome.
The Sweetheart Bar, it was a place that needed more protection than it had.
Mm-hmm.
There were people who wanted to go there and party who weren't necessarily friendly, but were
Mm-hmm.
more interested in watching the show.
Mm-hmm.
But it was a haven for people
Mm-hmm.
at the same time. It was mixed men and women, I think.
It was. And also, what you said about it too was that the bar had different sections. White Canadian heterosexuals are coming down to gawk. So there is this slumming element too happening there, but it sounded like it was mostly Black queer people, Black LGBTQ people.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. That's definitely true. So there was that slumming element that they were trying to keep out of it. But I think it was, very much based on the kind of parties and having a bar space where people could go and could actually, dance with women, which was
Yeah.
really amazing. And there was a chance for people to meet each other and to see each
Yeah.
other. But there was absolutely a kind of code of secrecy that you would, if you'd met someone, it reminds me a little bit of what it's like for people that are in AA today, where it's like
Yeah.
when you're in a 12-step program, when you run into someone that you've met in a program, you don't necessarily acknowledge that you know them because you don't want someone to ask you how you know them. And that was the same sort of idea. So people would often not necessarily acknowledge that they knew each other, but it was a place where they could go and dance together and meet each other and just like let down their guard a little bit.
Yeah, and dancing then was the core of everything, was all these spaces people wanted to be able to dance together, to touch each other around other people like them. They wanted to just know each other. That was amazing, even though they would pretend they didn't later. Just to see somebody else like yourself was radical.
Yes, and there was a gender expression element to this as well,
Yes.
where they could not only dance together, but studs or butches could dress in men's clothing or a more masculine women's clothing and express that part of themselves. And couples could express a butch femme dynamic or stud fish dynamic, and they could
Mhm.
have that together. And that was safe in that space in a way that it wasn't in other places.
Oh, we gotta talk about studfish. These are words that have not appeared on the podcast yet, and I'm very excited to talk about them. Can you tell us more what they mean?
Yeah. Well, I mean, fish might be a kind of a sexist term or might strike people that way. Fish is a more feminine side of a Black lesbian couple. Not all Black lesbians use that terminology, but a lot did. So it meant femme and more feminine, but attracted to other women. So fish was sexist because I think it was a way of referring to women. I think it was the idea in a sexist frame that, women smell like fish. I
Oh,
think
that one.
it's
Yeah, yeah,
very,
we've
very
definitely heard
sexist.
that. Yeah.
And I actually think that stud and fish were kind of class-based terms as well. I think they have some roots in prison culture. I think in
Mhm.
the same way that there are lots of parts of our popular culture that got started in Black communities in prison culture. It's a really
Yeah,
fascinating trail of style and terms. But I think it did get started there. And I think it was a term for feminine women, sometimes sex workers were called fish. And so it has its roots in sexism, but I think it was not one that the women who embraced it felt was sexist. I think it felt like it meant, Black femme, and they were proud about it.
that's awesome. That
Yeah.
it I Yeah, and I think it's a term that's a bit lost to history. It's something that I hear about even in St. Louis. There's a study in the '60s about studs and fishes talking about bars there. So the term does travel. It's used in different places. I haven't heard about it as much in New York City, but to think it's a term that does have meaning, it travels around, and it means a lot to people. Okay, this entire episode is not a setup about how important queer master's theses and PhD dissertations are, but OMFG, Ethel Sawyer's 1965 master's thesis is one of the most important documents to lesbi queer trans history, in my opinion. We have so few records of what Black queer women are doing in explicitly Black queer spaces, and not written about in a white lens that doesn't interrogate themselves, like the work Roey talked about doing that deep anti-racism, where you read, and you read again 6 million times, and you keep talking to people, and you don't write a white history. You write the history that people of all races and nationalities and heritage are telling you, and it is hard work, and it takes overcoming. Okay, this is another cool academic nerd fact and has a lot to do with the way that queer life has been shaped, so it's worth knowing. In the 1930s, there was a school of sociology called the Chicago School, which was based at, no, wait, don't guess. Yes, obviously, it's the University of Chicago. And this was a place that really started to focus on the construction of cities, and they were really focused on deviance. They were really interested at where Black people lived and how they worked and operated in a very privileged, entitled way. But something that's less talked about, I just learned from reading some amazing work by the Black queer scholar Kevin Mumford, is that they also were focusing on queerness and where queerness was located in a city. And that work continued over time. So in 1965, young Ethel Sawyer, who was at the University of Missouri, decides to do her master's thesis on Black queer women's spaces. So she goes to a bar of studs and fish. So before I read this, heads up, this is not deeply empathetic text about what Black queer life was like, but it's also not disdainful, which is pretty much a miracle for 1965. Here's a quote from her text. She describes her subjects as persons of lower socioeconomic status, though by taking occupation and income alone, a few could be considered more middle class. Some of those not actually belonging to the lower class, because of certain personal traits and attitudes, are excluded from associations with other groups of lesbians, who might belong to a different class, as evidenced in the remark, and this is the juicy stuff. Sue is what you might call a lesbian whore and has gone with damn near every stud in St. Louis. The school teacher said, cut her loose. Of course, Sue is labeled a lesbian whore because she's a sexually active fish femme. And now she's writing about Jim, who's a stud. If a status hierarchy were to be constructed, Jim's group would fall at the fourth lowest class. At the very bottom of the hierarchy would be those, quote, loud and dirty ones who are boisterous and make trouble, a lot of them down on Franklin Street. Members of Jim's group are generally separated into two categories of studs and fish. Studs dress similarly to males, slacks zip up the front, short haircuts, no lipstick or makeup, men's shirts or women's boyish-looking blouses, etc., and attempts wherever possible to minimize their female characteristics, many wearing t-shirts underneath clothes to replace bras. Fish, on the other hand, dresses women in every respect, and to a casual observer might not appear to be in the life. However, aside from this obvious physical distinction, which serves at once to designate who is and who is not available as a possible mate, there are the matters of appropriate mannerisms and behavior, domestic responsibilities, attitudes towards homosexuality, the larger society oneself, which accompany each of the two roles. The two roles are complementary, i.e., a stud and a fish make up a homosexual couple. And I'm going to give us one more quote from Dr. Sawyer because so much has changed and nothing has changed. I've heard this from dykes of every decade in every state and every country. Here's Dr. Sawyer. To have sex with a man, while it is a clear-cut case of dislike for the studs, is one of ambivalence for fish. They both like and dislike it. While it may follow naturally from having a date with a man and getting married to a man, both of which they value, and it is also a necessary condition for having children, which they also like. Their conception of themselves as being homosexual perhaps influences their attitude about having sex with males to the extent that they place negative values on engaging in sexual practices with persons of the opposite sex. My goodness, you don't say, Dr. Sawyer. Now back to Roey.
And stud was the term that was for more masculine presenting women. Although I think if I had it to do over again, honestly, Jack, like I feel like one of the things I missed at the time because it was the 90s was how much I assumed that studs identified as women. I'm not sure that that's always true. I think some did
Mm-hmm.
and really felt themselves to be masculine women. And some, I think, we would now call either non binary or trans.
Yeah.
Um, and
Yeah.
and would have, and there were people who said it to me outright. When I look back through my notes of that time and when I think back through my memories, I remember people trying
Yeah.
to tell me and I couldn't understand it. But so anyway, it was definitely more masculine. People who had been assigned female at birth and who had would lived as women and who maybe did live as women in some parts of their lives. And their public presentation might have been with feminine pronouns, although not always. Yeah. So studfish couples would get on the dance floor with the stud taking the masculine role in dancing and the fish taking the feminine role in dancing, and they just had amazing times. There was a one of the people I interviewed had been a photographer, and she had taken pictures at Black lesbian gatherings.
No.
Yes,
Wow.
and I tried to get her to say that she would leave those to the lesbian herstory archives in her will. She was quite elderly at the time, and I don't know if she ever did that. I don't think she did. But I got to see a lot of those photos, and they were
Oh.
very much of couples that were, studfish couples, very proudly so. And they were just beautiful. They looked like prom photos.
So what did the photos look like? Like, what
Yeah,
were they wearing? Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. Oh, I so wish I could show them to you. I wish I could look at them, actually. I don't have any of them, but wow, I was just dazzled.
So what are they wearing? Tell us
Oh
about
my
them.
gosh. They were wearing the most beautiful fashion. Like everyone was dressed, right? And they were dressed in like the 40s, 50s, stylish, like what you'd wear to go out. So the studs were wearing suits. Sometimes they were pinstriped with obviously fine material, men's jewelry, and the fish were wearing beautiful dresses. Lots of times they were really form fitting with high heels. And
Yes.
there was just, I mean, there was an element of glamour, and they were posed photos. They weren't candid shots. They were like somebody had a setup with a camera, right? And they were just like the photos that you might see on somebody's wall or in somebody's photo album, except they were two women.
Wow.
Yeah, 2 Black women, and I know of no corollary in Detroit for white women, right? Those kind
Wow,
of
yeah.
photos didn't exist in the same way, and I think in part it's because the women who came to these events, the studs and fish, were often Black middle class in many ways, or solidly working class, which counted as Black middle class at the time, right?
Yeah.
Like a good paying job, a union job. So you could afford nice clothes, you could afford to go out. There could be a photographer at these events, you could
Mhm.
afford to buy the photos. It was it was class based in some ways.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure how, I think that class line was a little bit fluid, but there was an attempt in making safe spaces to like kind of keep people who felt safe to each other in the fold.
Yeah. That makes a ton of sense. And going back to the Sweetheart Bar, you have these amazing quotes from a person identified as Billy Hill.
Yeah, yeah.
About the back section of the bar, there's a pair of double doors, and behind it, you could have a drag performance alternating with time for dancing. And the space was divided according to sexuality. Billy Hill says, quote, two women could dance or two men could dance together there. So the straights would come in and sit on one side just so they could see all this, what was going on. Then the middle section was more or less for bisexuals, and they go men or women. Then over in this side, it was gays, mostly girls, but boys too, but mostly girls. And you say that like the straights are keeping the bar in business, like their patronage is fueling that, right?
Yes.
And then that also some of these straight men, heterosexual men, are coming in and trying to start fights to beat up probably studs, I'm assuming mostly, and to target them, yeah. And I
Yeah.
wouldn't be surprised if they were also targeting gay men. So like there's some sort of glimpse of safety, but you don't know when it's going to be interrupted. I mean, that has been Black life in this country forever. Safety, I've always thought, is a white concept. The bar is open for 10 years, which is incredible for a lesbian bar of any moment in history that it's open for 10 years.
Well, it was such an interesting bar in terms of the geography of it. Because of that, like it was definitely a kind of transitional bar. It was one where middle class white women did not
Yeah.
feel safe in that bar. Middle class white women were afraid of being exposed. Like if they were
Mhm.
teachers or if they had more of a white collar job, they did not feel safe there because there were straight people who knew about it and these men who would come in. And I also assume that some of the fights were over
Mm.
women, were men who were interested in some of the women and the butches were
Mhm.
not having it.
Yeah. And there are white spaces happening there. There are white bars. They're totally segregated. Are they in different parts of the city? You say that the black bar is in the manufacturing area. Is the white bar near there, or is it a different part?
I approached this with this question. My question was, how did we get from the kind of openly gay neighborhoody bar to the bars that I encountered in the area when I was coming
Mhm.
out in the 80s. And those bars were heavily guarded. You wouldn't even know they existed. You had to know and practically have the secret knock in order to get in. There were no signs on the outside.
The sliding grate, did you have the sliding grate at the eye holes?
We did not have the sliding grate, but we did have like it felt very unsafe to go back around behind buildings and you couldn't tell where you
Yes.
were at and you were just hoping to find it. And so that question, the way we got there was that there was an evolution of these bars. It was very hard for a woman to get a license for, to open a bar and then to be able to have the clientele to sustain it. Those who could afford to be out and in a space, who could take the social risk to be out and in a space and be openly queer, were marginal in other ways. And they didn't have the money to support a bar and keep it
Yeah.
in business. They might have had the desire to do that, but it
Yeah.
was very difficult. And so one way that this evolution happened was this idea that there would be the front of the bar that straight people could go to and they would just hang out and that was straight. But if you knew about the next level, you could keep going back in the bar and it was queerer there, but it still was not
Yeah.
entirely safe because there were straight people that knew about it
Yeah.
and wandered in. And so it was from there being this idea that there were lesbians who to actually support a bar, but weren't going to risk being outed or being physically endangered. How did you get those women? And it was by
Mhm.
secrecy. It was by enhanced security and secrecy. And also, a certain level of behavior that they would find acceptable. So they were less rough and tumble. They were, a little squeakier clean so that the better off white lesbians would feel safer
Mhm.
there.
That makes so much sense. I'm also thinking, because we're talking about the Rust Belt, what is now the Rust Belt, but at this time, union jobs are thriving, and that having read most of the lesbian newsletters through history or other documents in the Gale Archive of Sexuality online, and it's really the Rust Belt union jobs that afford any kind of lesbian solidity in public spaces, and this shows up in Finn Enke's book, Finding the Movement, um, and I really also you can see it in Stone Butch Blues by Leslie Feinberg if you haven't read, which it's also a good text to go back to and be like, how did
Absolutely.
people imagine transgenderness? Because if anybody would have known, Leslie Feinberg would have known, I think. Yep, they were the shit.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and so like how people are finding one another, imagining one another. In Stone Butch Blues, there's a lot of chat about white butches fighting over women and this like claim to women. Like that's what it's like about how masculinity and femininity are playing out too. It's not trans people are doing this.
Right. I mean, all this is based in a really strong tradition of bar culture in the
Mm.
Midwest, right? So, where do you go? You
Mhm.
go to the bar. And I think, especially for white working class people, but also for Black working class people, you're absolutely right about the jobs and the unions. This is a time, lots of women had gotten, and a lot of Black women had gotten
Yes.
factory jobs for the very first time in the 40s and early 50s. And those jobs paid really well. They allowed for like a level of paying for entertainment that you couldn't get before that,
Yes.
that was not to people who were, had been excluded from it. Yeah, absolutely. And there was a real expression of a kind of 40s and 50s masculinity and femininity over what women's roles were. So femmes were often expected and some were happy to take on a more traditional feminine
Yeah.
role in relation to their partner, and same with the butches and studs who their idea of masculinity was seeing their dad, seeing men, and it was formed by that. And
Yeah.
so it was not necessarily a new gender frontier in terms of seeing how people actually behaved or what their expectations were, but because these were people who had largely been raised as women, it wasn't exactly the
Yeah.
same either. And they were definitely transgressing.
Stone Butch Blues, there's a Butch and Butch couple that are in hiding, and that there are femme for femme couples, but this is like unimaginable to even dykes in the time. And in fact, Leslie Feinberg, I think somewhere in like around the 80s or 70s in the book, reunites with this friend that they had refused because how could you be in a Butch on Butch couple? And says, I'm so sorry. Like, it really, this was, I was so out of it. That was absurd. Of course you can be. Of course you do why do I get to judge that? But that hasn't, like, that in the imagination hasn't really happened yet. And I think even until the late aughts and the teens is really when it takes off, as there's increasing transitioning among trans people publicly and talking about it, and access to hormones and surgeries and language, and making more language that you can be, pre-surgery, post-surgery, never going to have surgery, never going to, but you could still identify as trans. Like, that really changes in that period, and then it makes for so much more queerness too. Yeah. So it's a long time coming.
Yeah, and it's so interesting to me because it has always existed, but it has not always been understood, and not been understood the
Yeah.
same way. Like, how we understand it
Yeah.
has really evolved.
Of course, gender expression has evolved. In the last 2 days, I have a 7 and 11-year-old, and they both came to me and showed me the same Garfield cartoon where Garfield turns 40, and at the end says, "Kids these days," and then is shocked that he said it. And they both pointed at me and said, "You did this." And I was like, "Thank you so much." But kids these days, my gosh, non-binary identities, the multitude of trans identities that have unfurled, and so much beyond and around and against it, ways of doing and living gender, agender. How delightful. Oh my gosh. And I've been a part of it, but also to witness its flourishing over time is extraordinary. And we are going to pause here. This is the end of our first part with Roey Thorpe, but you've got to tune in next week because we're going to talk about the long, beautiful history of lesbi, queer, trans sex workers, and they're important in spaces in Detroit. Tune in next time. Same Les time, same Les channel. Thanks for tuning in to Our Dyke Histories in collaboration with Sinister Wisdom. Connect with us on Instagram and Facebook at Our Dyke Histories. Follow and support me, Jack Gieseking, via my newsletter, Queer Geographies, at queergeographies.com. It's packed with everything we couldn't fit into this podcast. Our Dyke Histories is run by a queer, dykey, and mighty team. ODH is hosted, edited, and produced by Jack Gieseking, co-produced and co-edited by Cade Waldo, and co-edited by Mel Whitesell. Our social media manager is Audrey Wilkinson, and our fabulous interns include Michaela Hayes, Sid Gunthart, Paige LeMay, Sophie McClain, and Sarah Parsons. Our theme song, Like Honey, was graciously gifted to us from Kid Orion at kidorion.com. We're forever grateful to our co-producer, Julie Enszer, and the entire team at Sinister Wisdom. Publishing since 1976, Sinister Wisdom recognizes the power of language to reflect diverse, multicultural lesbian experiences and to enhance our ability to develop critical judgment as lesbians evaluating our community and our world. We share our dyke histories so we know more about who we are, how we were, and what we fight to never forget. Let's keep doing it, y'all.